This is Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast, hosted by Cody Schultz and Ben Horn. We start this episode off by discussing the student teaching I will be doing in the spring, which will be a bit of a change to my way of thinking about the English language arts classroom and the curriculum around it. Namely, it seems there will be a lot more creativity allowed in the class, which I'm all for. This leads to a discussion around business practices, figuring out the best path forward for you as an individual, and how good things don't simply fall from the sky, but instead have to be chased after. We end the episode by talking about the editing process, namely Photoshop versus Lightroom, and how one can get to better know their photographs through that process. Let's dive right into it, shall we? Cool. So, this has been a weird week. I've been doing a lot more observing. I started doing some substitute teaching, get some hours in, get used to being in charge of a classroom kind of thing. Cause
What age group?
high school,
High school.
yeah. I got my placement for student teaching come the spring, and based on the email that he sent to me, it's going to be an interesting couple months. I think it's like 12 weeks, something like that.
Oh, wow.
So I'd emailed him, and from the recommendation of one of my past teachers, that he said about asking what kind of books are going to be read while I'm there, so that way I could go back, read them, like familiarize myself with them, and then when I go to make my own lesson plans and go to teach it, I'm not trying to read the book or that section of the book, make a lesson plan for that section, and then grade papers and do all of that stuff all at once. That way my plate is kind of like more evenly dispersed. So sent my initial email to my cooperating teacher, and when he got back to me, which is what makes this so interesting, is he doesn't do a typical curriculum with his English class. So he's not reading books from the like stuffy old white guys kind of thing that everybody else does. Instead, he started the year off talking about like narrative writing, so like writing memoirs, and then doing an open mic in front of the class so that the class can share what they're talking about and what they wrote about and all of that. And then right now they're talking about artistic voice, like following along with Frida Kahlo, and then the students are going to be working to find their own artist and doing a little bit of research on them, and again having like a paper or an open mic kind of thing after that.
Yeah.
And then when I'm there, it's going to be, I think he said like a true crime kind of thing, which is really fascinating. Like, because it's something that in an English class I've never even like thought of teaching or learning. But he said that in terms of things that you can think or read about in advance, some topics that are going to be reviewed from January forward are like the Columbine school shooting, the Harvey Robinson, who was a serial killer from Allentown, which is right where that school is.
Oh, wow.
FBI's organization or disorganized profiling techniques, and general crime stats in the U.S. and their connection to our culture of family, consumerism, and other institutions. So it is not at all what I thought it was going to be in terms of like content for a high school English class.
Yeah, that's definitely not what I would expect at all. It's interesting because it's kind of playing into what some of the, popular stuff out there is right now with regard to there's like this obsession with like the true crime and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's an interesting take, and it's far different experience than certainly I had when I was in high school.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing that he said too is like, he said that he thinks it's going to be a great placement for me specifically because he said that because it seems like I'm a creative person, and he doesn't know me from Adam, so in my link, I always have or my link to my website is always in my signature for my email. So he must have looked at my website and been like, oh, you're a creative individual. Well, so am I. So this is going to be a great collaborating force. And it's cool too because he teaches yearbook and media design as well as English. So English is like the morning, and then yearbook design and media design is in the afternoon. So it's going to be I'm looking forward to it. It'll be interesting.
Yeah. Do you think that's going to be a lot more work for you than if it had been kind of the more traditional type, English class? Because I mean, I can see how, you could tie in your own experiences if it was more of like the traditional class based on, your experiences when you're going to school and with similar topics. But this is kind of a whole different sort of approach, which it seems like it'll have you thinking differently. That's for sure.
It's definitely going to be more work because of that aspect, because I can't just right now I can slap together a unit plan pretty easily for teaching Shakespeare or teaching 1984 or something like that, just because you also have so many resources available to you from other teachers as well that have already done it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think this is going to be a lot more fun. To actually be able to get creative with it, to encourage creativity from the students, to see what they all come up with and what they think about. It's definitely going to be more work, but it's going to be a lot more fun.
Well, that's cool. That's exciting. That'll definitely be a change of pace from what you may have been expecting. But I think that sort of stuff is often a very good experience in the long run, especially because it gets you thinking differently. So that is pretty cool.
Yeah, the only downside with it is that their classes start at 7:15 in the morning and run until 2:45. And I am about 40 minutes away from the school.
Oh wow, yeah. So that's gonna be early. Yeah. That's a very early start for sure.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that at all.
You'll be on my alarm clock time.
Yeah. Yeah, might need some tips and tricks to waking up and staying up that early.
Caffeine's a wonderful thing. That's for sure.
So, in other news, outside of my schooling a bit, I recently had a Zoom call with Matt Payne from F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen.
That's cool.
I sent him an email asking for some business advice because on here in the past I've talked about trying to figure out the print sales side of things and business side of things in general to get some money flowing. So we sat down for about 2 hours or so and gave me a lot of actionable advice that some stuff that I'd thought of before but never put into place, and then some other stuff that I wouldn't have really ever even really considered or thought of on my own. So that was on Monday night that we talked, and I've been slowly starting to implement things. I've been going through my website and rebuilding it. I think my smarter choice right now, at least, is to stick it out with Squarespace until I have time to actually learn other platforms or figure out where my path is going forward.
Yeah.
So I've been slowly building out that and then working on some new ebooks. So got plenty of those lined up right now. Try to figure out
nice
what I'm all going to do and what my path is going to be going forward. So
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure. You know, when you have a passion for something, but then finding a way to make that into a consistent, reliable income while not sacrificing that passion in, you know, in the process of doing so. There's definitely an art to that. And so that's good that you're able to get some good feedback and resources to work from for that. So that's definitely exciting news.
yeah, and it was really refreshing because I had told him too before that I had a bad experience with it a couple years ago, back in 2018, end of 2018, with the having a consulting call, because that's essentially what this was. So a business consulting call, trying to get some advice, and forked over $400 and didn't get any advice from this other guy, and it left such a bad taste in my mouth about them, about the whole idea as a whole. So when I had emailed Matt and he mentioned like, hey, I do these business consulting calls, they're at this price, and just because he values his time, and that's a big thing that he had been taught from when he did these business consulting calls with someone else, and I respect that, obviously. And so I just let him know, and I'm like, I just don't want to get burned again. But this was totally different experience, and makes me think about there's that quote, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always gotten. And the whole idea that good things come to those who like push for them, which I think is a concept that people really need to get behind, because I've also had people tell me in the past like, oh yeah, just keep doing the work that you're doing right now and things will just come to you. Things will fall from the sky and come into your hand. I'm like, no, that's not how that works.
No, it's definitely the sort of thing where, you know, you have to take initiative and kind of perhaps at times step outside what you're accustomed to doing in order to make those sort of changes happen. I mean, even just from like a like, I don't know, like an exercise standpoint, you know, it's when you start pushing yourself even further kind of beyond what you normally do that you start to see changes happen. And I think the same is very true when it comes to, you know, kind of growing in terms of a creative standpoint, artistic standpoint. And even if you just think about like what happened during the pandemic, when so many people had an opportunity to perhaps do that thing that they've always wanted to do to kind of change things up. But then once they had all those weeks or months to do whatever they wanted to, they just ended up doing mostly the same thing that they've always done. And so it's kind of a little bit of a microcosm for, you know, how it is day to day over a much longer period of time, you know, over a lifetime. So that's definitely is a very good quote. We have to sort of step outside that and make those changes happen ourselves.
And I think of even the podcast that I've been interviewed by in the past year or so now. I mean, I just essentially sent out an email to them. I'm like, hey, if you're looking for someone to be on your podcast, someone new and whose voice isn't often heard kind of thing, might have new perspectives or whatever, let me know. And ended up being on 4 or 5 different podcasts at that point because of that. Wow. Just because like they were looking for new voices and I felt I had something to say. And so I just reached out instead of just waiting for that off chance that I might
and there's also the times when it's the, you know, we run up against some sort of difficulty for one reason or another, and that adversity is what also helps to point us in a different direction that we might not have gone before. And I know that that's certainly been my experience for many things where, like back when I used to do the books, and then that company that made the books went away. So I started doing the portfolios, which ended up being like a very good move. So sometimes you have to sort of, fight that adversity a little bit in order to force that degree of change.
It's amazing what happens when you're forced to take another path. Like at the very onset of that, it could seem like a really bad thing, or like, oh, this is a sucky situation. But then you actually take that other path and you realize, oh, this is where I was meant to be all along.
Yeah, you're like, why wasn't I doing this sooner?
Yeah.
Why hadn't I thought of this sooner? Because, we become very much a representation of just the status quo of just, if we do, just like you said, if we keep doing things the way we're doing, you're not going to end up anywhere different.
I mean, that's like when Matt and I were talking, the one thing that, so when I scheduled this call with him, he had me fill out a couple different questions. And one of them was what my goals were for my photography, for the business side of things. And I had put down about print sales. But then by the time that we got on the call and we started talking a little bit, I started to realize more and more, like, at the end of the day, I don't really care about selling prints. Like, as nice as it would be to have my prints hanging on someone's wall, and as appreciative as I am for those in the past that have purchased prints from me, I don't need to be selling like 6 figures a year from prints.
Yeah.
I'd much rather, and I get more enjoyment instead out of the writing that I do and providing value in that manner to people. And so that's one of the things that we really focused on. And I started to, like, even as we were talking, I'm like, wow, this makes so much more sense. Like, this aligns with me in a much stronger way than what print sales would have or anything like that. Like, there's so many plans now that are slowly being set in place that will slowly take off in the next couple months, couple years kind of thing, that I think are going to lead to a lot more intrinsic success than anything else. So
yeah, because you have to look at what you gain, I'm not talking monetarily, but like what it is that sort of feeds your soul in terms of the type of work you are going to be doing. And I can see how writing is one thing. It can be a very fulfilling sort of process, versus it seems like if one is trying to do all that they can to make all their money from print sales, it feels like that is just, it's a difficult situation, because you're not necessarily you're not producing something that has that same level of fulfillment. And it seems like that at a certain point is just a matter of following the recipe, following the formula that other people have followed for success, but perhaps it being somewhat of a hollow success, because perhaps the images that people are selecting, they're not the ones that speak most to you, versus it's a much more personal experience with the writing and tying that to the imagery and the lessons learned and everything along those lines, which is one of the things I've learned a little bit by doing some of the ebooks. I find that to be a very fulfilling process.
Definitely.
But with prints, I feel like it's just kind of like, I mean, you'll see some people that make an enormous amount of money selling prints, which is fine. But I feel like you have to cater to some other aesthetic other than your own. You have to cater to some other goal other than your own, or some other. It doesn't feel quite the same.
It's one of those things where with an ebook, you are giving something to someone that has value past just a oh, that's a pretty picture on your wall kind of thing.
Yeah.
Versus with a print, it's just that. It's you are taking money in exchange for something that they're going to hang up, and in all reality, they'll start to get really used to it, and they might even get bored of it at some point.
Yeah.
Like that's happened to me before with some of the prints that I have that I've since taken down and replaced with others, because I get bored looking at the same image all the time, and I don't appreciate it as much until I have left it down and put it away for a while.
Yeah. And it is interesting because when I don't sell a lot of prints, but I sell a handful, and it is very fascinating to hear the reason why people have selected the prints that they have. And what I really do enjoy about the way that I go about selling the prints, which is, not tons of them, not trying to game the system, just it's mostly to people that connect with that image for one reason or another, but hearing why it is that they connect with that image. It's usually something very, very personal. Usually it has some degree of emotion to it. It's not just, looking for that epic, sunset to hang on the wall. It's because that image did have an impact for one reason or another. And I feel as you scale things up to the point where a person is just selling a ton of prints, I think you would lose that connection. I think you would lose that individual touch.
Yeah.
And it would be perhaps become a little bit more of a hollow existence by just chasing the numbers and trying to get that, 6-figure salary from it.
Yeah. I mean, I still plan on offering prints at some point on my website, and if I do exhibitions or anything small time like that, then I gladly will, because I still love printing my work. I still feel as though that is the final product of my photographs. But
yeah,
like with you, I'd much rather have whoever goes to purchase a print have a very close-knit connection with it that you might not get with everyone buying your prints. If you're selling a ton of them each year, if you're selling 20 prints, 40 prints, 100 prints a month, you're not going to get every single one of those people looking at your images and being like, oh yeah, that speaks to me personally, because some people might start to see it as an investment or something otherwise.
Exactly.
So
yeah. Well, that's interesting to see where you'll be taking things with that, and so always good to seek out that sort of advice and feedback from others. I'm never really one to do that. I'm more so the type that just likes to, try to cut through a forest with a machete and try to find a path. And it's not the way I'd necessarily recommend doing things, but I think it's just the way that works better for me in my brain, because I need to have, I don't know. I feel like I need to go down the hard path myself sometimes in order to learn from it. But I definitely admire those who, seek out that the wisdom from others who have been in those positions. And I don't know. It probably would have got me to somewhere a little further on in my career a little faster, but I don't know. It's all part of the fun.
yeah, I mean, I highly recommend anyone who's thinking about it to book a consultation with, even if it's not necessarily with Matt, but like Brooks Jensen. I also did a little review thing or whatever that I sent to him, and I'm waiting back to hear from him. Like $50 to send off some images and get your images reviewed, but also you can ask questions about marketing, about business in general to him, and he's been in the game for forever because of lens work.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things of like, yeah, you can go down the hard path of things, and ultimately I still am going to. Like, the path that I take is not going to be an easy one, but
yeah,
at the same time, to at least have someone to talk to that has gone down that path and is able to help clear your mind and focus your mind along with, so that way you can get a better idea of what it is that you actually want to be doing. And that's really why I wanted to go ahead with this stuff, even though it costs money. It definitely was worth it at the end, but
cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So I've been going through the process over the past week or so, because when we had recorded last week's episode, I had just gotten my film back a couple days prior. And at that point, I still wasn't quite sure what I had from the design trip, but I've gone through and I've scanned the images, and I've always found it very interesting, the process of getting to know not just one image, but an entire set of images. And I think that's also something where, it's a bit unique to shooting film in a sense, because, you're seeing it for the first time and then you're scanning it in, you're taking a look at it, as opposed to seeing them as you go when shooting digital. But I've really, it's interesting because the images that at first catch my eye, I'll go through this process where my first instinct is I like this image. And then I start having these creeping doubts in my mind of, oh no, I think I'm starting to not like this image anymore. It's starting to, not be what I thought it was. And it's like they're morphing around before my very eyes. But one of the things I like to do is I like to, scan the images in and then just have them all open in Photoshop and just flip through them. And this is something I mentioned in the past, where when I am first working with those images, I'll just flip through them, look at it for a split second and do a couple tweaks to it, move on to the next one and go through it until things are a little bit more, I don't see as many things that I want to change on them anymore. But I was thinking as I was going through this process, when it comes to photos and editing and such, that I'm wondering if people are in some cases going about the editing process in a rather convoluted way.
How so?
I think most people these days are using Lightroom versus Photoshop, especially for digital. I think I'd asked you in the past. So are you using Photoshop or Lightroom? What is it you're working with?
I primarily use Lightroom these days.
Do you have Photoshop?
I do, yeah. I use Photoshop for pretty much just for my printing needs. I print out of Photoshop. Don't ask why. I just always hated the Lightroom module for printing and found Photoshop easier. But
a little while back on Twitter, I asked a poll of, are you proficient with Photoshop? And it's a little bit of a open-ended question, because I guess it depends on one's definition of proficient. But in my mind, proficient is if there's something that you want to do with that image that it's, you can do it without thinking about it. It's not that every single person knows every single, way of doing something in Photoshop, right. But for one's own way of working, whether it feels familiar and comfortable working in Photoshop. And so of the poll, it says, are you proficient with Photoshop? Yes, 39%, no, 61%. And which was kind of interesting, because I think a lot of people are intimidated by Photoshop and they're sticking with Lightroom. But what I was thinking about when it comes to image editing, and I think this is influenced by the fact that a lot of people are tending towards Lightroom these days, is that a person will open an image, they realize the image needs to be edited, and then they just start sliding the sliders until it looks the way that they want it to. Which, on its very face, is, that's just the way that people edit. But I was wondering to myself, as I was working with some images in Photoshop, if people know why they're editing things the way that they are, or whether they're just moving around the sliders until it looks right, or whether they know what's actually wrong with the photo to begin with. Because I think if we start with the question of why does this photo not look quite right, the answer may be something far more nuanced and far more subtle than is addressed with, just going through all the different adjustments and adjusting those. And since you work in black and white as opposed to color, I don't know that this applies quite as much, but you'll see it where a person will open up their photo, they'll edit it, and then it will end up being extremely saturated, extremely contrasty, very sort of cartoonish, and it strays probably quite far from where the original was. So I had this photo that I shot on my trip to Zion, and it's of the floor of this grove of trees. So you don't see any trees. It's just all this reddish sand. And there was some water that was flowing through there a few days before I was there. So you see like the dried mud ripples, and then there's all these leaves that are strewn about it. And as an example, I opened up that photo, I looked at it, and I'm like, something's not right with this image. And so rather than going through and starting to adjust the color, the contrast, all the color cast, all that sort of stuff, the first thing I did is ask myself, what is it that's wrong with this image? What is it that I'm picking up on? Because something's not balanced right. I didn't start cropping it. I looked at it and I realized this image needs to be flipped horizontally. And it was as simple as that. As soon as I flipped it horizontally, it was really well balanced. And that took out that sort of that nagging feeling that I had in the back of my mind that something's not right with this image. And I was able to find it was just because it needed to be flipped, and it visually flowed better. And then beyond that, I did a couple little tweaks here and there, using the curves tool just to fine tune the contrast and some stuff along those lines. And there was still something that seemed a little bit off. And I realized that there was one small area that needed to be burned down just a little bit, just very, very subtle. But I think one of the things when it comes to getting to know a new image is really answering the why when it comes to editing, as opposed to just going in it gung-ho and just flipping things. And because that usually results in something that is a very roundabout way of addressing some minor thing that probably, didn't need to have all that stuff done to it. So that's just one of the thoughts that I had while working with the images, is that usually it's a small solution that brings things into better balance.
It's an interesting way of looking at it, because it's definitely a lot more thoughtful of an approach than what I've taken with any of my work. Because, I pretty much throw it into Lightroom, and I'll go through and I'll play with the exposure, I'll play with the highlights or shadows, and then the curves, and then most of the time I'll add like a slight vignette to it. But that's pretty much the same thing that I would have done in Photoshop as well. Just I would have used the curves for the entire process.
Yeah.
But I like the ability, like the organizational aspect of Lightroom the most. And that's why I typically rely on that rather than Photoshop. And that way I can keep everything in just one spot, in one application. But I think my editing choices really come down to the fact that I want to be away from the computer as often as possible.
Yeah.
And I know that if I would really look at an image and think, and then start to get to dodging and burning and the more quote-unquote advanced techniques, I would find myself just being dug into a hole and then spending far too much time on the computer than what I would actually like. Even though it doesn't sound as though you take a ton of time to be editing your work.
No. And And it's interesting because I do have Lightroom on my computer as well. I never really use it. I've heard so much good stuff about it, and so I did open up one of my images in Lightroom and was adjusting it there. And it was, a lot of it's because I'm not as fluent with that software as I am with Photoshop. But it just seemed like Lightroom made things that would be very easy and quick to do in Photoshop. It made them a bit more difficult to do. It was a more roundabout way of doing things. And I felt like I didn't have the same level of control as I have in Photoshop. And just as you were saying, it really is the curves tool in Photoshop just has tremendous control over an image. And that's basically, curves and layers and masking is basically all I used for my image editing in Photoshop. And it's does not take very long to do. But I also asked on Twitter, another poll on there says, are you proficient with the curves tool in Photoshop? And yes was 48%, no was 52%. So I was just thinking about how, since Lightroom seems to be more dominant and the style of editing in Lightroom is more so what people are doing, I think people are staying away from Photoshop because perhaps it seems a bit intimidating. But in some ways it might be a bit like, I don't know, like working with a large format camera, which seems on the outside like it's this very intimidating, difficult thing to do, but then you realize it actually is not that difficult. It's actually fairly simple when it comes down to it. You don't need to know how to do everything. You just need to know how to do a handful of small things. But you do have more fine-tuned control. And at least in my standpoint, the process of editing lends itself a little bit more to the approach I was talking about earlier in terms of, asking yourself why an image is a certain way, as opposed to just, having page after page of sliders where you can, tweak all the different things to try to get them to the end result. So it was just some idle thoughts while going through the images and tweaking them.
So how do you organize your images then, if you're just running it out of Photoshop?
So I just have folders on my computer. So I have an external hard drive, and when I come back from a trip, I'll just have a folder on there. They'll have just the date, and then it'll say, Zion Fall, and then just within that folder are the images. So it's not depending on any sort of, databases or anything like that. I just open up the image I want in Photoshop. Now, obviously, this won't work well if a person has, hundreds of thousands of images. Maybe they're shooting wildlife or something where they want to have more control over finding a specific image. But you can still browse those folders just using Bridge or open them in Photoshop. And actually, that's the way I've always done it. I have folders dating back to 1999 when I got my first digital camera. And it's just organized by date and then usually a couple of words for the summary of what's in the folder. And it's something that's independent of, any sort of software. It's just because it's just folders on the computer.
Interesting. I think it also helps that you don't go out nearly as often as like what I do, for instance. You have your organization works very well for having condensed trips throughout the year, folders for each trip kind of thing. Whereas with me, it gets very cluttered very quickly. Because if I go out for every weekend and come back with an image each weekend or so, it can make things very chaotic, which is why I like to use Lightroom, because then I can at least see everything from that month or through that year and pick and choose things and that kind of deal.
Yeah. How long have you been working with Lightroom?
I've picked it on and off since I started with photography. I think I started primarily with Lightroom and then started to use Photoshop instead of it for a year or so, and then gone back and forth since then. It's only recently, though, that I really started to use Lightroom for my film photography.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of seems like they keep building more and more into Lightroom, kind of making it the new Photoshop. So it is kind of interesting how Photoshop has sort of fallen out of fashion a little bit, but it also seems like Lightroom might be getting a little bit more top heavy in terms of cramming so much into it that it's not quite the simple software that it used to be. And at a certain point, people look at Photoshop and like, oh, it's just easier doing it in Photoshop. But I don't know.
I think
it's just my perspective as a longtime Photoshop user.
I think it also doesn't help that Photoshop was never designed specifically for photographers, whereas I think Lightroom was, more so at least.
Yeah.
So Lightroom inherently has a lot more of a, it's a lot easier to get into and to open up and just start playing right away. Whereas with Photoshop, it has so many advanced capabilities that people get very easily intimidated by it, even though you're really going to be using maybe 3 or 4 tools for most of your work.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I use curves and maybe the black and white mixer or something when I was shooting with digital, or gradients, that kind of thing. But
yeah. Yeah, and when it comes down to it, you don't really have to know a lot of stuff. I mean, curves is huge. I think people are intimidated by the curves tool, but then they realize, oh, I can adjust contrast, exposure, color casts. I mean, there's so many things that you can adjust with that. But between that and then layers with masking, maybe the levels as well. Sometimes it's a little easier for certain things than curves. But like I'll do the warming filters and stuff like that are built in sometimes for some images, but you don't need to know a lot. But I think having that level of control, where you can fine tune something to the point where there's no surprises once you make the print, look at it on the paper. It's like, yep, this is exactly as I thought it would be. And so it's, I don't know. I'm probably a relic just by saying, "Oh, I use Photoshop," But yeah,
the odd
not
man
hard to do.
out.
Yeah,
You just like to get away from the crowd. I mean, you're using an 8x10 film camera and using Photoshop, so people inherently are going to look at you like the dinosaur in the room.
Exactly. Photoshop, shooting 8x10, somehow still thinking that inline skating is cool. I think, I know there's like the saying that, if you do something that's not cool long enough, it becomes cool again.
Yeah.
Well, certain things never become cool again, but I don't know. I think it's just so much more fun to do. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. And you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.